Welcome to One-on-One with Expert Flyer. This is your host, Lisa Caslin, and today I'm really excited. We're talking to Maggie Reardon, and she is a senior reporter for CNET, and she has been closely following the stories that have been circulating for a while now around 5G mobile network and its potential effects on flight safety. And I really wanted to kind of get underneath things, particularly since the House Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure met on February 3rd. And I just wanted to kind of get a little bit of a recap on this topic with Maggie because she's so close to it. And I think she can really put it into terms that we can all understand. So welcome, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I don't know that everybody is aware that even though this whole thing has kind of bubbled up into like this chaotic mess, that actually, government officials and agencies have been talking about this type of thing and 5G and expanding the spectrum and auctioning, space on that for like a decade, right?
Yeah, and actually longer than a decade, really. And it all comes about because as we rely on wireless technology more and more, we need spectrum to be able to access those services. So the latest and greatest is 5G. That's the next generation of wireless. And for carriers to be able to offer those services, they need spectrum. And it's basically like real estate. There's just not enough of it. And so what has to happen is there's, airwaves out there that have already been licensed and already used that maybe aren't using the airwaves quite as efficiently as they could.
Mhm.
And so, the FCC is trying to manage that and figure out like, well, okay, how can we use some slices of this a little bit differently or share the spectrum, so to speak. And so they've been working on this issue, for a long time, at least since 2010 when or 20, I guess, yeah, maybe 2008 to 2010 is when they first really started talking about how are we going to share this spectrum. And then they identified this particular C-band spectrum is going to be really important for things like 5G.
Okay, so that sounds all well and good, and obviously people want their phones to be faster and more powerful and all that good stuff, and people don't necessarily, when they think of that mobile networks, they don't automatically think about air travel and how this might affect air travel. So what seems to be happening is radio frequency. I guess it's just they're altimeters, right? Is the name of the instrument. And they
Yeah,
measure.
so
Go ahead.
altimeters, radio altimeters are used on aircraft to measure the distance between the aircraft and the ground, right? Or other objects that are in the way. And so they're using a radio frequency that sits somewhat close to this C-band spectrum that Verizon and AT&T and other companies want to use for 5G. And so when that happens, when you have different parties using spectrum for different purposes and they're kind of right next to each other, sometimes the signals can bleed into each other. And what has happened with the altimeters is they receive signals and they don't have, a lot of them don't have filters on them. So they're basically hearing interference or hearing signals from neighbors next door, like the 5G spectrum. And so that is what the problem is. It's that these altimeters, when they were first put into place, like there was no 5G. Nobody was using that C-band spectrum that was right next door. So it didn't really matter. They didn't need the filters. But now they've got new neighbors and they're hearing everything that's happening, and that could cause interference and cause a problem.
Okay, so after a lot of confusion, the House subcommittee hosted a hearing, and really what came out of that hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is an acknowledgement that the process is broken, right? But where do we stand now? I mean, putting aside, we don't really, know who to blame for all of this. What is going to happen now?
Well, first, I just want to sort of say the hearing was a little bit lopsided. Not a little bit; it was a lot
Yeah.
lopsided. We heard from the head of the FAA,
Yep.
and we heard from a lot of industry folks in aviation. There was really no representative from the FCC
Yeah.
or NTIA, so that was a bit unfortunate. That because I
Yes.
think if they were really interested in getting to the root of this, they should have had everybody there.
I agree.
But needless to say, so where do we go from here? I mean, I think what FAA is doing right now is, the issue is these outdated altimeters, right? The ones that don't have filtering technology so that they can potentially hear what's happening in 5G. And so really what needs to happen, and I think everybody knows that this needs to happen, is they have to figure out a way to either replace those altimeters or alter them in some way. But that's a big job and potentially expensive. And so the first thing that I think that the FAA has been doing is identifying, well, like which planes are using the old altimeters that, could potentially be bad. That's like number one. You got to find out where the problem is. And so they've been doing that, and they've been doing that pretty rapidly. Now, the way they've been doing it, from what I hear from the aviation industry, is like, it still isn't like great for them because they're issuing all these notices, and it gets a little bit confusing about which aircraft are, okay, and which aren't, and what you need to do. And you need to have like different ways of, being able to land. So I don't think the problem is 100% solved, but I think the aviation industry is kind of like working around it. And then ultimately, I think what will happen, hopefully, is that they'll identify which ones need fixing, they'll fix them, and then we'll have, some coexistence between the 5G, transmitters and these altimeters that are receiving signals.
Okay. So right now, is there sort of an exclusion area where the telecom companies cannot erect these towers near airports? Is there like a 2-mile radius or something like that?
Yeah. So that
currently?
was part of the mitigation that they agreed to in January, was that when they were rolling out 5G, that they were just right around areas of certain airports, and it's not all airports, that they were going to either turn down the signal, not transmit, or sort of, change the direction of the way the signal is blasted out. But that's going to expire this summer.
In 6 months,
and
right?
these were all voluntary. Like there's nothing binding from the government saying like, Verizon, you must do this. So, at any time, Verizon could say, I don't really want to do that anymore.
Oh
I want to
boy.
roll out 5G, all the way. So the expectation, obviously the Verizon and AT&T spent a lot of money on these airwaves, and they want to roll it out everywhere.
Sure.
So, I think they want to eventually get rid of the exclusionary zones.
Okay, so then the airline industry is under tremendous pressure to get these altimeters retrofitted, replaced, whatever it is, in 6 months.
It's not going to happen in 6 months.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be a longer term issue. And I think, certainly folks who know aviation know, I was surprised as somebody who covers, I cover telecom. I don't really cover aviation. But when I started talking to people about this issue, they were like, look, a lot of planes that we ride today, that the American public flies on, are ones that were introduced, like 30 years ago. So that's like older technology that, that they just can't go in and replace, and that's like considered a modern plane. And I'm like, 30 years ago, that seems like a really old plane.
It does. It
but
does.
It's not.
I know. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, I don't want to, overblow this or, dramatize it, but I mean, should we be worried about this? I mean, it doesn't seem like, there's a real, clear plan. If, one entity can do what they like, whenever they like, without any clearance from, the FAA, or, it just, seems a little.
Yeah. Well, I
scary.
would say for this particular issue, people should feel okay about flying because
Okay.
I think they're on top of it, right? So they've identified that there could be a problem, and that's even in dispute, right? Like the FAA says they think that the interference could be harmful. What the what the FCC has
FCC.
found from their testing is that they don't think that the interference is really notable or would be anything that would cause a problem, right? So there's a dispute in terms of like even the research and the data in terms of the interference, right? So I think that it's probably fine. It's also the FAA, not even probably, I would say it's
Probably
fine. The FAA has identified which planes they think are fine. And for the ones that they still have questions about, they just have given different instructions to flight crews about what they do. And this really only comes into play when it's bad weather, right?
Yeah.
When they can't see the runway or they have low visibility. So they have other ways of landing the plane.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that the FAA is allowing planes to go up that are unsafe. So I think people, they've taken mitigation issues and I think they're doing a good job. I think, it's more of a problem for the industry because
Yeah.
it's more of a headache for them because
Sure.
they have to comply and, do workarounds. And that's not really a great way to run their business.
Yeah.
So, but I think in terms of safety, I think people should feel confident about that.
Okay.
On this idea of the agencies and the infighting, I think that this is a problem.
Yeah.
Again, this is a very inside baseball, bureaucratic kind of issue, but we're going to have more demand for spectrum. And like I said, at the top of this interview, a lot of the spectrum is already in use.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to find ways to share it. And a big issue coming up is that we have a lot of spectrum in government hands, which the FCC does not manage. FCC only manages commercial spectrum. So it has to work through this NTIA group, which is part of the Commerce Department and under the purview of the president. And they're supposed to be the agency that really coordinates like what's happening at the government level in terms of how they're using spectrum. And, nobody wants to give up any holdings that they have. So there's going to be a lot of infighting. And I think what this issue brings up is like, are agencies just going to go around NTIA and directly fight with the FCC and say, no, Congress has said that this spectrum is okay to use and that the FCC needs to auction it off. And then DOD comes in and says, no, we want it back. I mean, it's not a good way to handle the policy of how we use this critical resource. So I think that's going to be the big fight that people need to watch out for.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right. I mean, I have to ask, I mean, I think there's something like 40 countries that are successfully using 5G and flying around the world with no problem whatsoever. So what is it that they're doing that we're not? I mean, why I mean, I understand they're on a different part of the spectrum too, right? I think their signal is
very
further
slightly. I mean, it's not that different actually. And that's sort of one of the beauties of this particular sliver of spectrum is that for this 5G service, it's what they call harmonized, so that you can go to Europe and your phone that uses the C-band spectrum will be able to work in Europe. That wasn't always the case with previous generations of wireless. And I'm sure any of the travelers out there will know that, a lot of times in the early days when you had a 3G phone, you went to Europe and like, it just wouldn't work, not because there weren't agreements between the carriers, but because the technology didn't sync up. And so that's what's kind of really exciting about this C-band is that it is pretty much the same spectrum that they're using in other parts of the world. It's slightly different. I think the reason why it's maybe been a little bit easier in Europe is just, again, the bureaucracy is different there. They don't have multiple agencies managing spectrum.
Yeah,
they have one agency, that's managing it. And also they, for example, France had a lot of these exclusion zones sort of put in place initially around airports and so forth. So, they just kind of it seems like they did a little bit more work on the front end,
Yeah.
whereas, I don't know what was going on for the past decade where this problem, was out there, and that it didn't seem like anybody was doing work to figure out, like, how do we solve it? It was just seemed to me like a lot of complaining.
Yeah. And paper
But,
shuffling.
what do I know? I'm just a reporter.
Right. All right. Well, this has been great, and you've kind of quelled our fears. And I hope for the best, and we'll see what happens in the next 6 months, right? We'll have to check back with you, because I assume you're going to keep following this, right?
Yeah. I'm expecting that this is going to, it could potentially flare up again, in the summer as these agreements sort of
Right.
sunset, and then, sort of see where is FAA in terms of identifying the problem and getting a plan in place to fix it.
Right during travel season. Perfect.
Right.
All right. Well, listen, I don't want to take up any more of your time. It was great. Thank you so much. And I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, anytime.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, Maggie.